I had a defect since childhood, and I knew that I could never become a father. I got married, but my wife did not know anything about this, that I could not give her the happiness of having children. But suddenly, one day, my wife became pregnant. I was completely shocked. Everyone in the house was happy, and so was my wife. She was calling the child mine, while I knew very well that I was impotent and could not become a father. But when the truth came before me whose child it actually was, the ground beneath my feet slipped away, and the sky collapsed over my head because that child, as soon as 15 years of my marriage passed, my wife became pregnant. Since I knew that I could never become a father, I told my wife. 20 years had passed since our marriage, and we were still deprived of the blessing of children. Then, after 20 years, suddenly, my wife's health deteriorated. It was revealed that she was expecting. But I had never told anyone until today that I lacked the ability to become a father. And now, my wife was about to become a mother. I took the reports and went to her. Allah Almighty has said in the Holy Quran that husband and wife are like garments for each other. Do you know what is meant by calling husband and wife each other's garments? The job of a garment is to cover the flaws of the body, to conceal your shame. You know about it yourself, but the garment hides it from others. Yes, that is the role of a husband and wife for each other. That is why they have been called garments for one another. This means that if a husband has any flaw, any deficiency, the wife should hide it from the eyes of the world. And if a woman has any shortcoming, any deficiency, whether it is physical or of any other nature, then the husband should cover it from the world, should not let it become visible to others. They should act as garments for one another, concealing each other's flaws and shortcomings. Today's story is just like that. When I look back at my life, I remember this very verse. My name is Ajar Siddiqui, and my wife's name is Amna. Siddiqui is my name. 20 years have passed since our marriage, yet we are still deprived of the blessing of children. Let me tell you that I was the only son of my parents. My father passed away when I was in the 12th grade. He was an employee in a government office, and after his passing, my mother and I never faced any financial difficulties. We continued receiving my father's pension, and we had our own house, under whose roof my mother and I took shelter. In this way, our livelihood continued through the pension, and life kept moving forward. When I stepped into adulthood and completed my education, I secured a good job. Then my mother started looking for a bride for me. Her search ended when she found Amna. Amna was a distant relative of ours, and she became my wife and came to our home. Like many other families, my mother too began expecting good news within 2 or 3 months of our marriage. She started looking at Amna with hopeful eyes, and after 4 months had passed, she started asking questions. One day, I sat my mother down alone and explained to her, "Mother, please don't ask Amna about this repeatedly. It does not seem appropriate. This is Allah's will, His blessing. When He wishes, He will bestow His grace upon us." I tried to make my mother understand, but since I was her only son, she would forget my advice after a few days and become restless again. In this way, 2 years passed in waiting. By then, I also began to take the matter seriously and took both myself and Amna to the best doctor in the city for a checkup. The doctor advised us to undergo some important tests, including an ultrasound. We were supposed to receive the reports after a week. That evening, while returning from my office, I went straight to the hospital to collect the reports. I took them without checking and sat in my car. Before heading home, I thought, why not check the reports first? I opened Amna's report first, and everything was perfectly fine. No issues were mentioned. I placed her report on my lap and then opened my own report. As soon as I saw it, my hands began to tremble. My report was negative. The results were completely zero. According to the doctor's findings, I was incapable of becoming a father. Seeing all this, I became extremely disturbed. Instead of going home, I went straight to the doctor. I showed him the report and sought his advice. The doctor looked at me and said, "Look, Mr. Siddiqui, there are many medicines available, but..." The doctor said, "I can give you medicine, but let me tell you the truth, when a defect comes from nature, it is rarely cured. Naturally, your chances of becoming a father are very low. Medicine might improve it, but I cannot say anything with complete certainty. I will prescribe you the medication. Keep taking it. If Allah wills, He will be merciful to you, but there is no guarantee. The doctor wrote the prescription, and I took the medicine in my hands. With a lifeless heart, I returned home, went straight to my room. Amna was my life partner, my companion. Just by looking at my face, she could tell that I was disturbed. She immediately brought a glass of water and sat beside me, asking, "What is wrong? Why are you worried?" I placed my report in front of her. As soon as she saw the report, the color drained from her face. She sat in silence for a while, looking at me. Then I asked her, "What will happen now?" Amna replied, "Look, if the defect was in me, your mother would have wanted you to remarry. But now that the issue is with you, will you tell your mother about this?" I said, "If you ask for my opinion, I never want to tell anyone about this." Amna responded, "All right, I won't mention it to anyone either." I asked her, "Will you be able to live with me without children?" Her response was beautiful. She said, "Look, Allah has chosen you for me. If there is any flaw in you, I accept you with it." That day, we held each other's hands and made a promise that we would keep this secret to ourselves. Time kept passing slowly. I was taking the medicine prescribed by the doctor, but as time went by, we remained deprived of the blessing of children. On the other hand, as time passed, my mother's anger kept increasing. Her behavior towards Amna started changing drastically. This hurt me deeply. I had repeatedly explained to her not to taunt Amna for being childless, but she never understood my words. To be honest, that time was extremely difficult for both of us, but it was especially hard for Amna because all eyes were on her. Everyone would ask her, "When will you give us good news? Why don't you get treatment? Go visit a spiritual healer. Get some prayers done." Everyone was after Amna. No one ever said, "Why don't you get yourself checked? Why don't you take any medicine? Why don't you go to a healer?" No one even looked at me while I knew the fault lay within me. In this situation, seeing Amna being targeted hurt me deeply, but she was a very patient and grateful woman. She never once voiced any complaint. It's not that we, as husband and wife, never fought. There were often times when we got upset with each other over one thing or another, but she never once taunted me about my flaw, nor did she break the promise we had made. Even after 10 years had passed, she kept this secret locked in her heart. She even endured my mother's taunts, yet she never mentioned anything about it in front of her. Many times, my mother would humiliate Amna in front of the women in the neighborhood. I once overheard a conversation myself. Amna was busy in the kitchen while my mother was sitting with 2 women. Pointing towards the kitchen, she said, "I want to arrange a second marriage for Ajhar while I'm still alive, so I can see my son's children. But I don't know what spell she has cast on him that he won't even consider it." Hearing this, I shook my head in regret and thought, if only my mother knew the truth that the flaw is in her own son, that her son can never become a father, how would she feel? Would she then allow Amna to leave me and marry someone else so she could become a mother? Because she certainly could. But perhaps that would never happen. Humans are so selfish, aren't they? They think only about themselves. Time continued to pass in this way. My mother remained firm in her stance, occasionally advising me to remarry and constantly taunting Amna. Amna, being a devoted servant of Allah, silently endured it all. Just like that, 20 years went by. And then, suddenly, our lives took an unexpected turn that changed everything for us. It happened like this. That day, before coming home from the office, I called Amna and told her to get ready because we would go out for ice cream at night. But Amna replied, "Look, there are only 3 of us in this house. If we both go out for ice cream, Mother will feel left out. Why don't you just bring the ice cream home so we can all enjoy it together?" Her thoughtfulness and kindness always won my heart. My mother, she cared for my mother more than I did, even though my mother constantly taunted her for being childless. I said, "All right, we'll do as you say." That day, on my way home, I bought a box of ice cream and reached home. When I arrived, Amna had already set the table for dinner. I placed the ice cream box in the freezer, and we all sat down to eat together. After dinner, Amna cleared the dishes while my mother went to offer her prayers. Amna and I went to our room. My mother told me to perform my prayers first, and then we would eat ice cream together. I agreed. In the meantime, I got up and went to the washroom. I was in there for about 10 minutes, but when I stepped out, the scene before me left me shocked and terrified. 2 men stood in front of me. Oni had tightly covered Amna's mouth with his hand, and the other was holding a pistol aimed in my direction. Seeing them like this, I instinctively raised my hands. I immediately understood that robbers had broken into our house. One of them kept the gun pointed at me while the other put tape over Amna's mouth and tied her hands behind her back. Then he moved toward me, doing the same, covering my mouth and binding my hands behind me. They left us in the room while the one with the gun stood guard over us. Meanwhile, the other man went into my mother's room. I was certain he had tied her up in the same way. After that, they began searching the entire house. They rummaged through our belongings, taking our mobile phones, laptop, jewelry, and cash, emptying the cupboards of anything valuable. They stuffed everything into a large sack and tied it shut. Watching their movements, I thought they would leave now. But before they could, something unexpected happened. The 2 men started whispering to each other. Then, one of them stepped forward, grabbed me by the arm, and forcefully dragged me into my mother's room. Once inside, he made me sit next to my mother, then locked the door from the outside and left. He went back to my room where Amna was alone. My body shivered with fear as I wondered what they were about to do. Why had they taken me out of the room? The horrifying thought that came to my mind made my heart race. Could they really be planning to do such a thing? The mere idea of it filled me with dread, and I began silently praying for Amna's safety. I begged Allah for help, but perhaps that night was not meant for my prayers to be answered. About 15 minutes later, I heard the sounds of doors opening and closing. Those 2 men had undoubtedly left. I got up immediately, stepped out of the room, and leaned against the wall. Using the rough surface, I began rubbing the tape wrapped around my hands. After struggling for some time, the tape finally tore apart. As soon as my hands were free, I quickly removed the tape from my mother's mouth. Then, without wasting another second, I ran toward Amna. But what I saw made my heart sink. She lay motionless on the bed like a lifeless body. At that moment, I realized those vile men had not only robbed our house, but had also stolen our dignity before leaving. I rushed to remove the tape from Amna's face and untied her hands. Then, I turned back to my mother's room and freed her as well. She, too, had already sensed that those robbers had committed an unspeakable act before leaving. After freeing my mother, I immediately went back to Amna, held her close, and tried to comfort her. I brushed her hair back and ran to the kitchen to get her a glass of water. That night was nothing less than doomsday for the 3 of us. The next morning, I took leave from my office. I was discussing with Amna whether we should file a police report, but my mother said, "What will come of it? Nothing. The police will keep coming here, calling you there, asking all sorts of questions, and nothing will happen." She had a point. Cases like these often led nowhere, and criminals felt emboldened to repeat their crimes. But I knew such monsters needed to be stopped. So, despite my mother's concerns, I filed a police report. 10 to 15 days passed since that dreadful incident. Slowly, we began emerging from its shadow. But Amna needed more time. She was going through a double trauma. Then, 15 to 20 days later, something unexpected happened. Amna's health began to change. She started feeling unwell. I took her to the doctor, and my worst fear came true. Amna was pregnant. Hearing this news, both of us were stunned. Amna looked at me with terrified, confused eyes and finally asked, "What'll happen now? What are we going to do? Am I supposed to bring this child into the world?" When my mother found out that this was all because of the robbers, she made my life miserable. I told Amna, "Don't worry, I will think of something." We both returned home. But before I could even bring up the topic, my mother called me into her room. She said, "Ajar, I want to talk to you." I sat beside her and replied, "Yes, Mother, tell me." She sighed and said, "For a long time, I have been telling you to marry again. But after everything that happened in our house 15-20 days ago, Do you still want to keep Amna? You should leave her now. I looked at her and said firmly, No, mother. I cannot leave Amna. She is going to be the mother of my child. My mother was shocked and asked, How can you be so sure that it is your child? I took a deep breath and said, Mother, do you remember the day the robbers came to our house? That day I had brought ice cream home. Amna and I were very happy because we had hidden some good news from you. We wanted to surprise you, and that's why I brought ice cream that day. But before we could eat it and share the news, everything happened so suddenly. Hearing this, my mother sat in stunned silence, then suddenly smiled with joy. She said, Such a big happy news, and you both kept it hidden from me all these days? I replied, Mother, we only wanted to keep it a secret until that night. We had planned to tell you, but then all of that happened, and in the process of recovering from the shock, we forgot about our happiness. That moment changed everything. From that day forward, my mother's behavior towards Amna completely changed. She started treating her with love and care, looking after her well-being. Amna was confused by this sudden change, so I told her everything. I explained how I had used the ice cream story to convince my mother that the child was mine. Amna looked at me in disbelief and asked, Why didn't you tell her the truth? I smiled and said, Just as you have protected my dignity for the past 20 years, now it is my turn. For the rest of our lives, I will protect yours. Amna smiled softly, rested her head on my shoulder, and closed her eyes. This story is based on reality. Even today, husbands and wives are like garments for each other, covering and protecting each other's flaws. How did you find this video? Share your thoughts in the comments. Until the next video, Allah Hafiz.